Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining Carla 2020 and welcome to today's conversation between Ylva Habel and myself entitled Reflections, Race, Film in Europe. My name is Themba Bhebhe. I'm a film industry programmer with several specialities, one of which is, of course, diversity and inclusion, in particular at the European film market, where I've been in charge of the market's diversity and inclusion initiative for the past 3 years. Ylva, over to you.
My name is Ylva Habel. I'm originally a cinema studies scholar and nowadays a senior lecturer in media and communication studies. And for the moment, I have been involved in the Swedish Film Institute's report on anti-discrimination regarding women, white women, women of color, and Black women. What is very particular about Carla 2020 is that the conference brings together researchers such as myself, as well as activists and film industry professionals.
Thank you very much, Wifty, for bringing together, as Ylva said, these 3 categories of individuals. And of course, most of all, thank you, Wifty, for bringing together Ylva and myself. So in today's discussion, Ylva and I are going to reflect on the ways in which race intersects with film and civil society in Europe from our perspective as Black Europeans working in film. So we do have a note on housekeeping of a very particular nature. Before we make a start, we have a reminder about the ethos of Carla 2020. We have a pledge that we're upholding that all the participants have to sign and commit to when they register with the conference. The pledge lays down some ground rules of anti-discrimination, mutual respect, and cultural safety. So I'll read: our speakers do not and will not condone any forms of discrimination by themselves or perpetrated by others on the basis of ethnicity, religion, geographical origin, skin color, religious beliefs, sexuality, gender identity, socioeconomic class, disability or age. Our speakers declare that they do not and will not tolerate sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, ableism, fascism, and other isms. It is quite a long list, but we wanted to really underline the fact that whatever those forms of discriminations are, these isms really do have no place at Carla 2020. So to get us started, we've seen quite a year this year with a global pandemic, which has laid bare all of the structural inequalities in terms of race, gender, socioeconomic class. In many places, Black and brown people have been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic due to pre-existing conditions and entrenched inequities of their social conditions. Of course, that pandemic has been very much followed by, the global uprising against racism and beyond the Black Lives Matter movements. We've seen a general kind of reawakening and reckoning with racism, both past and present, which has really shone a light on police violence worldwide. And also on structural racism in terms of housing, on employment, education, government policies, but also in our film industry, of course. And then in terms of history, it's really been a time of revisiting and revisioning racism in the past, in particular by challenging the names and the statues of all of those so-called heroic figures of the colonial era who populate those spaces, who populate our public spaces. And most of all, it's been, in many ways, kind of a reminder of the damage past and present, and how that past violence articulates with the violence of today. Most of all, and I like the analogy or the metaphor which was used in a panel during Cannes by Amelia Roy, who's the president of the Centre for Intersectional Justice and who will also be talking at Carla 2020. She used the metaphor of the matrix glasses. And it's very much this idea of the matrix glasses have been taken off to show the dystopian reality of racial oppression. And that was really visualized in 2 sequences. The first sequence of Amy Cooper, and the second part of that sequence, which was really George Floyd. We had the impression of staring you in the eye with its steely gaze.
I very much agree that there is a steely gaze of white supremacy that comes upon us during these times of COVID-19, because what has been sort of an invisibilized power structure now becomes very clear in your face. What we have seen is that the funding structures and the sort of emergency monetary funding structures have been sort of hijacked by whiteness and by larger corporations. When COVID-19 hit us this spring, both artists, cultural workers, cultural museums and institutions could apply for emergency funding. But in order to be able to apply, you had to estimate the loss you have made recently, or the estimate you think that you would lose during a certain time. And for many independent cultural workers and artists, it's not possible to estimate how much you're going to lose. And then you were not eligible for applying. So there were protests against these things and open letters. And afterwards, as spring drew on, we could see that those who landed the largest pots of money were institutions such as the ABBA Museum and other larger actors, established artists with administrations behind them that could make these applications quickly. So we very quickly saw a list of those larger corporations, companies, establishments that could receive funding, while artists and independent cultural workers still have to see some kind of money coming their way, and it's been almost half a year. When talking about white governmentality, what has been seen before and which is now reinvigorated by the racism that has been critiqued during COVID-19 and the anti-Black racism uprisings across the globe, is that white people decide to, rather than speak to us and to speak to Black organizations and other organizations of color that are already established and already have lots and lots of mileage of intellectual contributions, criticism, anti-racist initiatives. We already have those in place. And instead, white majorities, both in Sweden and elsewhere, replace these perennial forms of knowledge with newfound awakenings, like we need to begin to work against racism now. We need this initiative and we need to start funding this and that. So I think in England there has been a critique against these initiatives because those initiatives that are supposed to promote and mobilize research and activities against anti-Black racism, for instance, does not benefit the Black community at all, but instead gives money and employment to white people or other people of color. So with every new mainstream initiative, we see this dynamic repeat itself over and over and over again. And similar observations have been made, I think, for many countries.
I really just couldn't agree more. I mean, to go back to this, what you're saying, we've seen that very much reflected in all of the statements, pledges, you say, which have been penned over the past 3 or 4 months. And it really kind of underlines and highlights and underscores the way in which PWIs, so predominantly white institutions, and the way in which they behave, and this kind of constant reawakening that we have just realized. And we'll come back to this point of the we and who is speaking during the we, in that kind of locus of enunciation, let's say. So yeah, that's what's really we've seen with this kind of the past 4 months. It's been this idea of this kind of rendering visible of what we can really call institutional whiteness. So, you know, as you say, in the film world, we've seen a proliferation of all of these statements of solidarity and pledges and promises. And yet, you know, as we know, during the pandemic, many of these institutions, cultural institutions, filmic institutions were silent, particularly on the effects of that pandemic on Black and Indigenous people and other people of colour across the world. And we also saw that many workers who were working on diversity inclusion were furloughed or laid off, or many workers who were involved in initiatives, you know, which work with marginalized groups were also laid off. And that was mainly because of this, you know, mainly in part due to this binary, you know, essential workers, non-essential workers, which arose during this time where people like ourselves and other people within the cultural industries were seen as being almost disposable, and it wasn't really high up on the agenda. I'd be interested to know how you've seen that play out in Sweden in particular.
As yet, I don't think that I can summarize any hard facts around this, but see the tendencies. As I said before, independent cultural workers, actors and others who cannot estimate the losses they will make have so far been without money. And what you say about And what I said earlier about reinventing anti-racist initiatives, that's what we're living through at the moment. We are seeing the results of reports on anti-Black racism repeated. And I'm myself involved in another report, another part of that report, which is about qualitative interviews around Black people and their experience of discrimination on the job market. But what comes out there is that the difference between just salaries, because the refusal to acknowledge racism in Sweden has led to the invisibilization of suppression against Black communities. So the we that counts, do not keep track, since we don't talk about race and racism. We can talk about racism, but we should not mention race, is often the sort of understood imperative. But anyway, it was found out that the difference in wages could be as big as Black people only getting about 63% of a white person's wage in the equivalent position and profession, counting in factors such as experience, education. So Black people basically need to have almost a PhD in order to get the same kinds of job that white people and other minorities can get with less education. So that is a difficult fix. And since we're constantly awakening to this problem, we are also stuck with the imperative to discuss and debate. And we will come back to debating logics later, I think, as well. But the imagination is, or the collective imposed imagination is, that we should talk more about racism. And this talking mode keeps us passive, keeps us trapped into discussing, because another imposed, not really spoken logic, but assumed logic, is that we should all agree on what racism looks like. So it becomes also a discussion around what terms we can use. And there's gigantic resistance against using the word racism. So it's very difficult to get anywhere in these discussions. And maybe the brutality of what we've seen this year, the omnipresence of anti-Black racism in violent forms everywhere that gets exposed in the wake of the murder on Black people. Of course, that helps. White majorities surely see the urgency, but also what I've seen in the past is that this urgency sort of fades, and then we're back to normal. We are enabled, or the we that counts are enabled to see what anti-Black racism is actually about. And they also unlearn what they knew. So what we think we know about anti-Black racism is something that is constantly unlearned again.
And it's so interesting what you say, because that echoes with so much with what's going on and so much which has taken place in the past. I think you know that there's been a pledge which has been launched by a collective of cultural workers who are people of colour, called the Arts in Colour Pledge. And it's very much this idea of, business as usual, right? That we can't go back to business as usual. We can't go back to this idea that people aren't aware of what's taking place in terms of the marginalisation of cultural workers, and particularly those within the film industry. And you also talked about the fact that, the expectation that we have to deal with these issues, and that it's a reminder of a quote, I think, by Toni Morrison, and I don't have the exact quote in mind, but it's something to do with the distraction, right? That we have to deal with the distraction of having to deal with fundamentally what is work which is, that aims at including our humanity in the full spectrum of work and of course civil society.
Yeah, Toni Morrison writes, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Someone says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. what we see also is that the debate around Black Lives Matter has very much been picked up by others as an opportunity to lift their own experiences of racism. So Black people are already getting marginalized by other groups of color. And that is also a dynamic that we have seen in other countries. And I think that we must be, in the North, some of the last people to sort of show this same kind of dynamic. And it's very tiring, I must say.
Exactly. I mean, I think during this movement, there has been the wider, obviously, Black Lives Matter movement and its championing of the struggle against anti-Black racism within white mainstream societies, majority societies, right? But we've also, as not even a footnote, but as part of that movement, that has brought about also an examination of anti-Black racism within other non-Black POCs, which is particularly necessary, especially if part of the, the general movement in challenging and dismantling white supremacy must involve all of its effects, and one of those is anti-Black racism. I wanted to piggyback off what you were saying about the fact that this is a moment and you're not sure if, in a particular Swedish context, if you're really seeing a shift in awareness in anti-Black racism, in racism more generally, and in the effects of the pandemic. I think what's interesting about this period is that we've seen very much like the coexistence of two kind of counter-challenging discourses around both the pandemic, but around also what's taken place in terms of the global uprising. We saw, as we said, this proliferation of pledges and statements, and we want to help you, and we want to do more to fight anti-Black racism. We want to do more to fight racism more generally. We want to include you. We have to provide more resources and so on and so forth by many cultural and film institutions, but we also saw counter discourses come into play. So we saw some of the cultural workers who had worked for these institutions actually called them out for hypocrisy and double standards, because those very same cultural workers had actually faced marginalization. Some of them had called out the way in which those institutions treat films by Black, Indigenous people of colour. They kind of challenged the general status quo of the institutional whiteness and racism of those institutions, and they had faced retaliation. They'd been marginalized, they'd been placed into a box, they'd been fired. And so I think this is the important shift. The counter discourses, because we're in the 2.1 era, are the digital era. They are there and they are present, and they have very much kind of in some way dismantled those official discourses, if not at least challenged them. I think that's been one of the kind of the salient parts of aspects of what we're seeing now. We've seen open letters, particularly by collectives of workers who are people of colour, who've very much stated that there are these diversity policies, there are all these initiatives, but essentially the situation has changed. Essentially, films, they're still facing the same hurdles to have their films financed, to find producers, to overcome gatekeepers. And I know these are buzzwords, but it's really true, the fact that these gatekeepers have biases and they don't see the potential in some of these films because they don't see the audiences for the films, or they don't share the perspectives. And so, these are all hurdles which have been highlighted in all of these letters. And then most of all, we've seen, you're a researcher, and we've seen research appear during this time. And springs to mind most of all the research by Gemma Desai, who's a British cultural worker and who's worked in several front-running British culture and film institutions, and who's created and crafted a wonderful body of research which takes into account her perspectives, her experiences of other cultural workers who are people of colour, in particularly Black workers in the UK. And she really specifically also deals, as you say, with this question of anti-Blackness and the way in which non-Black POCs can contribute to anti-Blackness within those institutions. Yeah. She takes that on fully, and what she shows is very much a dichotomy between the positive diversity talk of cultural institutions and the positive statistics on the one hand, and on the other hand, the marginalization of certain Black and other people of colour within these institutions in the UK, and the way in which they centre whiteness in the way in which the audiences are conceived and the way in which the films are treated. And so I think, this idea of the dichotomy between the self on the one hand and versus the outward image is also something that takes place in Sweden. So I wanted to ask you how that plays out in Sweden.
There has also been similar protests in Sweden and open letters against what you could call white governmentality. And we see similar dynamics where there is sort of happy diversity talk and pledges, while everything is managed in the everyday through what we can call white governmentality. That necessitates white leadership, white initiatives, white ideas, and very Eurocentric cultural frames. So what you're talking about, not seeing the value of other types of narratives, is something that I think is the most usual problems of both Europe and the rest of the West, that white majorities simply cannot fathom, with a few exceptions, of course, that narratives can be done otherwise, that we don't need to adhere to already established narrative structures. What I see again and again is that both European and more Western norms about what signifies as an interesting narrative is very set and rigid, and that white majorities, when getting proposals, probably cannot. I don't have insight into this process. I can only make a qualified guess. But I think since we don't see these other narratives, they must be stuck and barred from entering, because there is such a uniformity of narrative standards that need to be loosened up. And they can only be loosened up by getting more Black and other people of color into power, into positions that matter. We cannot only be situated at the bottom of the hierarchy, waiting for funding, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for a seat at the table. That is very, very tiring.
So Ylva, we've covered the problem of Europe articulating race, the problem of Europe articulating its racism, the problem of Europe articulating its colonial past in the now. I wanted to shift gears back to the film industry, and also shift gears towards looking at the solutions and towards diversity inclusion policies now. We spoke earlier about this idea of the future perfect of inclusion strategies, the fact that they will, quite often when we talk to these institutions, it is always something that will happen. It is change which necessitates time. It will happen tomorrow, the day after, and so forth, right? This idea of this constantly self-realizing prophecy. And I think one of the boundaries, or one of the resistances which you've mentioned, is this idea of the necessity argument. Walk us through that.
One of the things that many of us run up against is the necessity argument. And the necessity argument comes when diversity work is going to be realized, and we discuss the phases or the directions and the focus of what we are going to do together. And very quickly, and then I mean almost instantly, Black people run up against what appears as necessary to do, and the priorities that white leaders of these initiatives or cooperations and projects think should be done. We necessarily have to go about it this way. We necessarily have to not listen to your priorities, but this is already decided. And that also comes as a consequence of inviting Black people very late into projects when things are already set, the framework is already set, cooperative partners are already set, the initial questions are already set. So when you come into that, the space that you are awarded is very conditioned and very small. And so through age, personally, I've become more and more reluctant to enter into these types of cooperation. So I will most typically give them a battery of questions. Have you thought about this? Are you thinking about doing this? What kind of future do you see for this initiative? What is it going to land in? What are the results? Who are the Black people working with this? How much power, or what kind of power are you planning to share with Black people themselves? Is it going to be only me? or only us four people who get minimal things to do, or huge things to do with too little time and too little pay or no pay. Because these are the circumstances that I keep on seeing. When you're met by the necessity argument, that is also a point where you can no longer discuss. I mean, racism is constantly thrown up for debate and becomes a question that is up for grabs. But when we're going to work with these issues, like diversity and what is called inclusion and anti-racist work, there are always necessities that are already in place when I enter. And as said, when we reach that point when white people tell me that it's necessary to do this way, we can no longer discuss, we can no longer negotiate, they can no longer hear that I might be more knowledgeable in this discussion than they are, because they have just started. They are enthusiastic. They want good things to happen, of course, and they don't see the difficulties I've seen. They don't see and don't have the experience that I and other Black people already have. We have seen dozens or maybe hundreds of failures of diversity works already. But maybe this person hasn't. It's their first time, or their first year, or their first position as a decision maker within a system that works with diversity. So there are so very different energies also that go into these types of situations.
Exactly. And I'm going to call up on my screen. I'll read this out because what you were saying, it really, well, it echoes, first of all, the question of sustainability, but also the question of critical whiteness. And I'll come back to those 2 points. The Arts in Colour pledge, as I mentioned earlier, is a pledge which was penned by anonymous collective of people of colour within the industry. I wanted to go for one of its points here. Everything you said just now echoed that, the first point of the pledge. I don't know if you can see the screen here, but this point,
yeah, I see.
Realize that you don't even know you don't know. Others' lived experiences outside your lived experience, and due to the negligence of our industry, largely outside mediated experiences, you cannot do inclusion work, especially as a white person, unless you start from a place of ignorance. If you do this work assuming you are especially smart and uniquely qualified, intellectually or morally to do diversity work, automatic disqualification. If you start with the attitude that you have so much to learn that you can begin with the understanding that you will always be learning, that's the positive, the upside, but the daily learning is a key action that makes these other actions possible. This is exactly what you've just said. It has to start on the part of predominantly white institutions and the white people working in those institutions with this idea that, these ideas or these experiences may be new to them, but they're not new to, people like yourselves who have been doing research for years.
And also what is made a necessity is not only the argument, but the necessity of white people being in positions of leadership. I don't think that they realize how much time we have to waste waiting for them to catch up. And of course, they won't catch up completely, but to catch up a little bit. We have to wait for them until they realize certain things, and often they don't do at all, and it just becomes a long discussion where they don't get it. But if we had sort of large groups of Black people and people of color that could just normally work within, for example, the film industry, I can't even imagine how much easier that would be.
And that was my question, beyond the effectiveness of critical whiteness as a tool to deconstruct some of the attitudes which you've talked about, how would you conceive measures which could be sustainable which could make this change sustainable? Because obviously the change that you've described, when it's brought into place with this necessity argument, isn't sustainable, it will fail. And you've mentioned many examples of diversity and inclusion policies which have failed, but how could that be made to be sustainable?
Well, I'm principally against sort of helping. The group that is subjected to racist violence should not be given the responsibility to solve the situation. So I will not do that, but say only that it's very simple. let Black and brown people in. It's simple. We don't need special pedagogies. We don't need special initiatives that are created especially for us. Need to be treated as people. We are grown-ups. We have competences just as everybody else. And something that I've encountered also for the longest time is something I call deprofessionalization, meaning that when racism gets into the picture of a discussion, it is also obstructing what we usually know about our occupations and other people's occupations. Or I should change this into what white people know about occupations, occupational skills, and so on. One of the recurrent observations in my work with the interview material of the report for the Swedish Film Institute was that actresses and directors get deprofessionalized in their everyday working context. They would be subjected to insults, being dominated, passed over, reduced to being ignorant, or imaged as being inexperienced. And in these contexts, their white co-workers also, in a sense, you could say, appear to deprofessionalize themselves. They demand sexist or racist things that they would never expect from a white man, for example, or they simply disregard due working process in ways that bring the entire set to a halt. So what could be the everyday humdrum of work, of film production, or preparatory work that gets obstructed by racist events? I won't give you all the concrete examples, but everything is brought to a standstill because white people simply cannot get over the fact that Black women or women of color, or women for that matter, can have experience, can, in the role of a director, for instance, ask a white man, can you do this? A director, for example, has a given position of power. They lead the work at the film set or the TV set. But I saw so many instances of both men and also other white women that were trying to subvert or go against that given power. And some of the women directors said that only when I raised my voice, I could get actors and photographers, for instance, to do what they were supposed to do. And many of them exemplified also that when a male director asks someone to do something, they do it. When a woman director, and particularly a director of color or a Black director, asked it, then there would be a discussion, or there would be a resistance or trivialization of the situation. So that is one example, or a few examples of deprofessionalization.
And so in connection with what you've just described, the lack of professionality, you've really highlighted the experiences of sexual harassment and misconduct that have affected Black women and other women of colour within the Swedish context. And this contrasts very much with the perception that we on the outside have of Sweden as being the beacon of the 50-50 movement, as embodying that movement, as a Swedish film industry embodying that movement, and of the Institute embodying that movement. What I wanted to know from you is, how did these experiences of these Black women and the women of colour come to the fore during the Metoo movement in Sweden? I assume that there was a Metoo movement also in Sweden. Yes, there was a Metoo movement, but it fairly quickly got into trouble since white women, as usually, because that is something that keeps getting repeated. White people take initiatives and rush ahead and forget that we're not all white. And then they have to sort of retract their steps and reconsider. But that stage or phase is very difficult in Sweden, because since so many of the white majority are convinced that racism is just not a structural problem, but an occasional accident, then they're never suspicious and feel the need
to think before they rush forward. So they rush forward with lots and lots of initiatives, and then afterwards they need to think, or are made to think by Black and brown agents within the same sector, that, well, you need to rethink this because this experience is not shared by everybody. In fact, the oppression that you speak of for white women is so much worse for Black women and other women of color. And it might look different from the kind of sexism and oppression that you as a white woman experience. So that was the problem of the Metoo movement as well, that very quickly there was also protests from women of color all over the place. And that is also recurrently when that second wave comes of critique, because it's only let in after a while when it cannot be silenced anymore. So it always appears as if it's coming after, in the wake of the protest, when in fact it is there all the time. So at this point, I wouldn't know what the Me Too movement has landed, but I do know that the negotiations that they've had around these issues about the omissions of racism has been difficult territory, to say the least. I won't go into detail, but it has been difficult because the denial in Sweden is so, and the structures work with this denial so much, since we cannot even often gain ground in normalizing an acceptance that racism is real. I mean, Black Lives Matter this spring and summer has helped, certainly, but it is still a moment, and we have yet to see what will be next.
Indeed, we'll see. And I think this gaze into the future is a very nice note to finish on. We are at time, so Ylva, thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. And if you enjoyed this conversation and would like to listen some more, we will have a longer version that will be posted on the Carla 2020 homepage.